Hello, team players, and welcome back to my Archetype series. I know I haven't covered archetypes in, 3 months? But I realized that some of these archetypes are probably going to get remastered in Player Core 2. And I didn't want to waste your guys' time by covering archetypes that are just going to get remastered. But we just got a bunch of new archetypes that are fully remastered in Howl the Wild. And I think the best one for me to start with for this channel is the Swarmkeeper archetype. Let's dive in. For this one, we have a lot to talk about with just the dedication. First off, you need to be trained in nature to take this dedication. You gain a swarm inside your body. This swarm essentially counts as an animal companion, which means you can't have a traditional animal companion in addition to this unless you have an ability that lets you have more than one animal companion, like from the Beastmaster archetype. You are immune to all damage that your swarm deals, and during your daily preparations you can choose up to 5 willing creatures to be immune to its damage as well. You can emit your swarm using the Swarm Forth 2-action activity. Using this activity essentially means you emit your swarm into a square adjacent to you, although it can overlap with your space. It remains separate from you until the end of your turn, but can be sustained for up to 1 minute. When you use this ability, and every time you sustain it, you can have your swarm stride. It has a 15-foot climb and land speed. This effect also ends if you end your turn more than 60 feet away from your swarm. When this effect ends, the swarm disperses into individual creatures and returns to your body after 1 minute, unless you're extremely far away as determined by the DM. While outside your body, the swarm can overlap with other creature spaces, as normal for a swarm, but it can be attacked while it is outside your body. It uses your stats for defenses, but is immune to the grappled, restrained, and prone conditions, as well as any mental effects that target a specific number of creatures. Your swarm has resistance equal to your level to all physical damage, but it also has weakness equal to your level to all area and splash damage. When your swarm would take damage, you take that damage instead. But if an effect would hit you and your swarm, you only take damage once. But it is the greater of the two damages. You can have your swarm attack by using the Bite and Swarm action. Each creature inside your swarm space takes 1d4 piercing damage, with a basic reflex save against your class DC or spell DC, whichever is higher. This damage increases by 1d4 every 2 levels. Overall, there are very few classes that can use this archetype well, as in order to use your swarm, you have to spend 1 action sustaining it, and then another action to command it to attack. So most spellcasters aren't going to be able to use this archetype very effectively, as most spells require 2 actions. However, marshals may be able to use this very effectively, especially since most marshals don't have a way of doing area damage. At least not very many ways anyway. I do think the witch could use this archetype very well, as a lot of hex cantrips require 1 action, and there are other hexes that require 1 action or a reaction to use. However, most other spellcasters probably won't be able to use this very effectively, including, sadly, druids. I think it would be very thematic to use this archetype with a druid. However, I just don't think it's going to work very well for them. But a very thematic way of using this archetype would be an animal instinct barbarian, especially if they chose an insect for their animal. But we'll have to see what the animal instinct barbarian is like when Player Core 2 comes out. Overall, there are definitely classes that can take advantage of this archetype, but it's not going to be good with every class in the game. Next we have Aphid Flash. For 1 action, if your swarm is outside your body, you can have it emit light. Doing so requires each creature in your swarm space to make a fortitude save against your class DC or spell DC, whichever is higher. On a failure, the target is dazzled for 1 round, or 2 rounds on a critical failure. Your swarm then emits light as if it were a torch until it returns to your body. This one can be good, but you're going to have to be careful with this. Remember that you and your allies are only immune to the damage of your swarm, not its other effects. Which means you don't want to use this when your allies are in your swarm space, or yourself for that matter. However, Dazzled is an extremely annoying condition to deal with, so giving it to enemies is good. After all, putting a flat check on enemies' abilities that target anyone is pretty good. Now let's talk about Pyre and Sting. For one action, each creature in your swarm space must make a Fortitude saving throw against persistent poison damage. This starts at 1d6, but increases by 1d6 every 4 levels. Should the target critically fail on their saving throw, they're also enfeebled 1 as long as they're taking the persistent damage. I do think that this ability is good, especially since it means if they fail, then you can use your swarm on another creature that might be far away. And it gets even better if they critically fail, because then they're enfeebled as long as they're taking that damage. But sadly, at the end of the day, most of the time, this is just going to be damage every turn. Which, don't get me wrong, is good, but it could be better. Weaver's Web, on the other hand, is pretty good. For one action, when your swarm ends its turn, it fills all surfaces in its space with sticky webs. These squares are difficult terrain. Any creature that ends its turn in those squares must make a reflex saving throw or be immobilized until it escapes. This DC is equal to your class DC or spell DC, whichever is higher. The swarm is immune to its own webs. This right here is fantastic. Not only are you immobilizing them in the swarm space, which means you can keep using other effects on them from your swarm, but it also means that they're staying right where they're at, which means other creatures don't have to worry about them moving around. This is awesome for ranged attackers, as everyone that is immobilized by these webs is one less creature they have to worry about. Plus, they have to spend an action to try to escape, or attack the swarm, and honestly, it's going to be hard for them to do area damage if they're stuck in the swarm. Unless, of course, they're very, very smart. Plus, not a whole lot of enemies have area damage anyway, so this right here is a fantastic ability. Now let's talk about Distracting Bites. This one is really built for Swarmkeepers who are melee attackers, or ranged attackers, I guess. Really anyone who uses strikes and not spells. Whenever a creature takes damage from your swarm's Bite and Sting ability, it is off guard against the first strike you make against it during your turn. I don't really like this feat because it really only makes them off guard against you. Don't get me wrong, it can be good with other effects that require strikes, but by itself, not great. And then we have Mobile Swarm, which increases your swarm speed to 20 feet. It also gives your swarm a swim speed of 20 feet. A faster swarm will always be good with this archetype. The swim speed is going to be a little situational, but it is good to increase your swarm speed. I do recommend you take this feat if you're a Swarmkeeper. Carried with the swarm essentially allows your swarm to carry you whenever it strides. This effectively means you don't have to spend an action moving if you want to move. But because you're moving voluntarily, this isn't considered forced movement and therefore does trigger reactions. If your swarm flies and you don't have a fly speed, then you fall whenever your swarm ends its movement. This right here is honestly great action economy, even if you don't have the mobile swarm feat. Granted, I do recommend you take the mobile swarm feat, especially in combination with this feat, as this is just free movement, which is great action economy. Sportlebore Choke is actually kind of insane. Your swarm attempts to force itself into the mouth of every creature in its space. They must make a Fortitude saving throw against your spell DC or class DC, whichever is higher. This deals 44 piercing damage to all creatures depending on their Fortitude save. This increases by 1d4 at 10th level and every 2 levels after. On a successful saving throw, the target takes half damage and is sickened 1. On a failure, they take the full damage and are sickened 1. On a critical failure, they take double damage and are sickened 2. Sickened is really rare as a player option, and there's a good reason for that. Sickened is what I consider to be the second best debuff in this entire system. It's literally a -1 or -2 to everything they try. And unlike Frightened, it doesn't go down every turn. Regardless of their saving throw, they are immune to this effect for 1 hour, but sickening a creature is pretty insane. I do highly recommend this feat for the Swarmkeeper. At level 10, we get another feat that's really good, although it's pretty simple. With Veil of Bugs, if you or any of your allies share your swarm space, you gain lesser cover. This is effectively a guaranteed +1 to AC. Granted, you do have to be in your swarm space, but remember that you and your allies are immune to all damage that your swarm deals. And there are plenty of good feats here that only inflict conditions if the target takes damage, which effectively means your allies are immune to the entire feat, while your enemies are not. A simple feat, but very effective here. With Buzzing Death Cicadas, your swarm gains a fly speed, and you gain the Death Drone action. Each creature in your swarm space must make a will saving throw against 64 mental damage. This is essentially a basic save, except that on a failure, the target is frightened 1 and takes a -2 penalty on perception checks that require hearing. In addition, should a target critically fail, it is frightened 2 and deafened until the start of your next turn. Again, this only works if the target actually takes damage, which means this will probably only affect enemies. And this does pretty decent damage, as well as making the target frightened. The minus on perception checks in the deafened condition is okay, but that frightened condition is amazing. I recommend this one as well if you get high enough to take it. And the final feat we got for this archetype is Expanded Swarm. When you release your swarm, you can make it huge rather than large. This is fantastic for a number of reasons, but chief among them is that you can choose whether to make it huge instead of large. There are some situations where it'd be better to leave it as large rather than huge. And this allows you to choose one or the other. But making your swarm huge allows you to target more creatures with it. Honestly, this in combination with other feats in this archetype can really mess up enemies. Especially if you can get them all huddled in one group. So that is pretty much everything for the Swarmkeeper archetype. I will say this. A lot of people are comparing this archetype to Shino Aburame from Naruto. And I do think that is a fair comparison. However, the thing about a show like Naruto is that a lot of the fights are one-on-one fights. And we've never really seen Shino use his powers to help out his team. At least not outside of using his insects to scout ahead. Which I don't think this archetype can do very well, mainly because of that 60-foot range limit. But this archetype can definitely help the team if you use it right. Especially since most of the feats don't actually work on allies because they're immune to the damage. At least that's the way I see it. I could be wrong on that, so let me know in the comments what you think. And honestly, a lot of the feats in this archetype have really good debuffs attached to the damage. In fact, the only feat I don't really like in this archetype is Aphid Flash. Mainly because it does affect allies, because it doesn't do any damage. But you can use it as a torch if you need one, which is good. But you can only sustain it for 1 minute, so that makes that less useful. But if you guys enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like so other people can see this video. And subscribe if you're interested in more Howl the Wild content. As with this book, I will definitely have content for a while. You can also become a member of this channel or join on my Patreon page to get my videos early, just like these people here. But if you're more interested in new witch options, you can check out this video here. Thank you guys so much for watching, and remember, teamwork is vital. It helps us solve problems.